In the summer of 1876, as America celebrated its centennial with grand exhibitions in Philadelphia, 41 men simply vanished from the face of the earth. Not in some remote wilderness, not during a natural disaster, they disappeared from the heart of Kentucky's tobacco country, from one of the most prosperous plantations in Warren County. Music swells ominously. Their names were recorded in ledgers. Their families waited for them to come home. Local newspapers noted their absence with barely concealed concern. Yet within weeks it was as if these 41 human beings had never existed at all. Pause for effect. Welcome back to Hidden Histories. I'm your host, and today we're diving deep into one of the most disturbing and systematically covered up disappearances in post-Civil War America. This is the story of the Beaumont legacy, a tobacco empire built on wealth, power, and what we'll discover was an unthinkable crime that reached into the highest levels of Kentucky society. Scene-setting music shifts to period-appropriate strings. Picture this. It's July 8. The sun beats down mercilessly on the rolling hills of south-central Kentucky, where endless rows of tobacco plants stretch toward horizons shimmering with heat. The Civil War ended 11 years ago, but its wounds still fester across the South. Reconstruction is stumbling toward its bitter end, and in Kentucky, a state that never officially seceded but was torn apart by the conflict, the social order remains in violent flux. The Beaumont Plantation sprawls across nearly 3,000 acres of some of the richest tobacco-growing soil in America. The main house, a Greek Revival mansion with towering white columns, overlooks fields that generate more wealth in a single harvest than most families will see in a lifetime. Spanish moss drips from ancient oaks that have witnessed decades of human suffering and triumph. The air itself seems thick with secret. Music fades to background ambience. And it's here, in this landscape of beauty and buried trauma, that our story begins with a question that would haunt Warren County for generations. What happened to the 41 men who entered those tobacco fields on July 15, 1876, and never came home? Before we continue unraveling this mystery that involves conspiracy, murder, and a cover-up that reached the highest levels of Kentucky society, make sure you're subscribed to Hidden Histories and hit that notification. You're about to discover why this story was buried for nearly 150 years, and why powerful people wanted it to stay that way. Transition music, building tension. To understand the magnitude of what happened at Beaumont Plantation, we need to step into the world of 18. The Civil War had officially ended, but in places like Warren County, the battle for America's soul continued in boardrooms, sharecropper shacks, and courthouse corridors. Colonel James Beaumont, and he insisted on the title, though his Confederate service was questionable at best, had transformed his family's pre-war holdings into something approaching a tobacco empire. Unlike many southern plantations that struggled to survive the transition from slave labor to paid workers, Beaumont had seemingly cracked the code. His plantation employed nearly 200 workers during peak season, most of them recently freed slaves and poor whites desperate for any paying work. Sound of workers in tobacco fields, authentic period atmosphere. The work was backbreaking. Tobacco cultivation required intensive labor, from planting through harvest, bending over young plants in the scorching sun, topping mature stalks to prevent flowering, and the grueling process of cutting and hanging leaves for curing. A good worker might earn $12 a month, enough to keep a family fed but never enough to build any real security. Among Beaumont's works were the 41 men whose disappearance would become Warren County's darkest secret. They weren't random laborers. These were experienced field hands, many with families, some who had worked the plantation for years. Men like Samuel Washington, a 34-year-old father of 5 who had been born into slavery on a neighboring farm. James Fletcher, a white sharecropper, whose own small plot had failed, forcing him to seek work for wages. Moses Franklin, barely 19 but already known as one of the best tobacco curers in 3 counties. Pause for dramatic effect. The last verified sighting of these men was on the morning of July 5. According to plantation records that would later mysteriously disappear, they were assigned to work the far southeastern section of Beaumont's property, an area known locally as the Bottoms, where the richest soil produced the finest tobacco leaf. But here's where our story takes its first dark turn. Music intensifies. Martha Washington, Samuel's wife, would later testify that her husband never came home that night. Neither did James Fletcher, according to his pregnant wife Eleanor. By the morning of July 16, Families across 3 counties were asking the same terrifying question: where were their men? The official story, the one that appeared in the Bowling Green Daily News on July 18th, was simple and seemingly reasonable. The 41 workers had completed their contracts and moved on to seek better opportunities in Tennessee or Missouri. Colonel Beaumont expressed his regret at losing such fine workers, but noted that with the mobility of free labor, such departures were increasingly common. Newspaper rustling sound effect. The article, which I've obtained from the Kentucky Historical Society archives, reads in part: Colonel Beaumont reports that despite offering competitive wages and fair treatment, a significant portion of his seasonal workforce has departed for opportunities in Western territories. Such mobility reflects the changing nature of agricultural labor in our region. Case closed, it seems, except for one problem that would take nearly 150 years to fully understand. Not a single one of those 41 men was ever seen or heard from again. Ominous pause. Not in Tennessee. Not in Missouri. Not in the growing industrial cities of the North. 41 human beings, fathers, sons, brothers, had simply vanished as if they had never existed. But someone was watching. Someone was asking questions. And that someone would risk everything to uncover the truth. Transition music building to cliffhanger. Before we reveal the identity of the person who first suspected something was terribly wrong at Beaumont Plantation, I want to hear from you. Tell us in the comments what state you're listening from, and whether your area has any historical mysteries that locals still whisper about. These stories exist everywhere, waiting for someone brave enough to dig for the truth. And if you're finding this investigation as compelling as we are, hit that like button and subscribe to Hidden History. What we're about to uncover involves a conspiracy that reached into the Kentucky State Legislature, and a cover-up that required the cooperation of law enforcement, newspapers, and even churches. The same networks of power that protected Senator Caldwell and Colonel Beaumont exist today in different forms. The same techniques used to erase the story of the 41 murdered workers are being used right now to suppress other uncomfortable truths, urgent present-day connections. But the same courage, determination, and moral clarity that exposed the Beaumont conspiracy can triumph over contemporary injustice. The same tools that Charity Mason, Dr. Otwell, and Judge Thornberry used: careful investigation, documentation of evidence, building alliances across different communities, and refusing to be intimidated by powerful interests, remain effective today. Empowerment message. The Beaumont legacy isn't just history, it's a template for action. It shows us how ordinary people can challenge extraordinary corruption and win. Building to crescendo. Most importantly, it reminds us that every person who stands up for truth, who refuses to accept injustice, who fights for the voiceless and the forgotten, is part of a tradition that stretches back through American history to people like Charity Mason. Emotional crescendo. She was a formerly enslaved woman who became a preacher when women weren't supposed to lead congregations. She investigated a crime when black women weren't supposed to challenge white men. She risked everything to seek justice for 41 murdered workers when it would have been safer to stay silent. And because of her courage, we know their names, we know their stories, we know that they lived and worked and died for the simple crime of witnessing corruption. Memorial tone. Samuel Washington, father of 5, James Fletcher, expectant father, Moses Franklin, 19 years old with dreams of buying land, and 38 other men whose names deserve to be remembered, whose families deserve justice, whose stories remind us that behind every historical statistic are real human beings with hopes, dreams, and people who loved them. Final call to action. The Beaumont legacy lives on every time someone refuses to let injustice stand, every time someone speaks truth to power, every time someone fights to preserve the stories of ordinary people who showed extraordinary courage. Their legacy is your opportunity. Their courage is your inheritance. Their fight for truth and justice is your responsibility. Powerful conclusion. Subscribe to Hidden Histories, share these stories, and remember, the most important history is the history that powerful people don't want you to know, because the truth, no matter how deeply buried, has a way of surfacing, and when it does, it changes everything. Final fade with period-appropriate music. The 41 workers of Beaumont Plantation have finally come home. Their story has been told, their truth has been preserved, and their legacy reminds us that justice, however delayed, is always worth fighting for. Jonathan Hartwell and Judge William Thornberry, whose preserved documents made this investigation possible. The Mount Olive Baptist Church in Warren County continues to serve the community today. Visitors are welcome. For more information about the Beaumont legacy and other hidden histories, visit our website at hiddenhistories.com. Remember to subscribe, hit that notification bell, and help us uncover the buried truths that shape our understanding of America. Until next time, keep questioning, keep investigating, and keep fighting for truth. The Railroad Conspiracy: How 200 Chinese Workers Vanished in Nevada, 1867. The Milltown Massacre: When Steel Barons Murdered Striking Workers, 1892. The Forgotten Genocide: Native American Children and the Boarding School System. The person who first smelled something rotten in Warren County was someone who understood exactly how power works in small southern communities. Someone who had seen enough injustice to recognize it, even when it wore the mask of respectability. Her name was Reverend Charity Mason. Atmospheric music, more hopeful but still tense. Reverend Charity Mason was not supposed to exist in 1876 Kentucky. Black women weren't supposed to lead congregations. They weren't supposed to own property. They certainly weren't supposed to challenge powerful white men about missing workers. But Charity Mason had never much cared what she was supposed to do. Sound of wind through trees, rural Kentucky ambiance. Born into slavery in 1834 on a small farm just outside Bowling Green, Charity had learned to read from the plantation owner's daughter, a crime punishable by whipping in many states. When freedom came in 1865, she was already 31 years old, with decades of pent-up dreams and fierce intelligence. By 1876, she led a small but devoted congregation of former slaves and free blacks, operating out of a wooden church they had built with their own hands on land she had somehow managed to purchase. The Mount Olive Baptist Church sat on a low hill overlooking the southeastern section of Warren County, the same area where Beaumont's missing workers were last seen alive. Church bells in distance. Charity Mason knew every family in the black community within a 20-mile radius. She performed weddings, conducted funerals, settled disputes, and served as an unofficial employment coordinator, helping connect workers with farms that needed labor. When Samuel Washington, James Fletcher, and 39 other men disappeared without a word to their families, she noticed. More importantly, she acted. Paper rustling. In the archives of the Mount Olive Baptist Church, which still stands today though the building has been renovated several times, researchers have found Charity Mason's personal journal from the entries from July and August of that year read like a detective's case notes, documenting her growing suspicion that something terrible had happened to the missing men. July 17th, Martha Washington came to me in tears. Samuel never returned home. She walked to the plantation but was told he had departed for Missouri. This doesn't sit right. Samuel spoke often of saving money to buy land here in Kentucky. Why would he leave without his family? July 20th, visited with Eleanor Fletcher. She is 8 months with child and desperate for news of James. Mrs. Beaumont herself came to the door, very polite, very kind. Said James left word that he would send for Eleanor once he was established in Tennessee. Eleanor says James would never leave her so close to birthing. I believe her. July 25th, spoke with workers still employed at Beaumont. They seem frightened. Moses Franklin's mother says Moses was excited about extra work in the bottoms. Said Colonel Beaumont was paying double wages for some special project. None of the remaining workers will speak of what that project might have been. Dramatic pause. But it was Charity Mason's entry from August 3, 1876, that would prove most significant. Walked the bottoms early this morning before dawn. The land has been disturbed. Fresh earth turned in patterns that make no sense for tobacco cultivation. Fence posts moved. Someone has been digging. Someone has been burying. Ominous music swell. What Charity Mason discovered during her pre-dawn reconnaissance would haunt her for the rest of her life. But getting anyone to listen to a black woman's accusations against one of Kentucky's wealthiest planters would require more than evidence. It would require allies in places where she had no right to expect them. Fortunately, Charity Mason had always been good at building unlikely alliances. Transition to more hopeful music. Dr. Jonathan Hartwell was not supposed to be in Kentucky either, though for very different reasons. A physician trained at Harvard Medical School, he had come south as part of the Freedmen's Bureau's medical mission during early Reconstruction. By 1876, most of his colleagues had returned north, their idealism worn down by Southern resistance and federal indifference. But Hartwell had stayed. He had married a Kentucky woman, established a practice that served both black and white patients, and earned a grudging respect even from those who disagreed with his politics. When Charity Mason approached him in August 1876 with her concerns about the missing workers, he listened. Medical bag sounds, period-appropriate Dr. Ambiance. Dr. Hartwell's medical journal, preserved in the University of Kentucky Medical Archives, provides crucial corroboration for Charity Mason's investigation. His entry from August 10, 1876. Mason presented concerns about missing agricultural workers. While I initially attributed her worries to natural anxiety about menfolk seeking opportunity elsewhere, her detailed observations warrant investigation. I have agreed to accompany her on examination of the area in question. What they found during their joint expedition to the Bottoms would transform a missing persons case into evidence of mass murder. Sound effects, footsteps through brush, rural investigation atmosphere. According to both Mason's journal and Hartwell's medical notes, their August 12 examination revealed clear signs of human activity, inconsistent with agricultural use. Areas of recently disturbed earth, personal effects partially buried in soil. Most disturbing of all, what Dr. Hartwell's trained eye recognized as evidence of violence. Dr. Hartwell's notes are clinical but chilling. Observed fabric consistent with work clothing embedded in soil. Metal objects including belt buckles and what appears to be a pocket watch. Soil composition suggests rapid large-scale excavation and refilling. Reverend Mason's concerns appear well-founded, building tension, but evidence and suspicion weren't enough to challenge Colonel Beaumont. They would need documentation, witnesses, and legal support. They would need someone inside the system willing to risk everything for justice. They would need Judge William Thornbury. Cliffhanger music. Before we continue with the story of how an unlikely alliance between a black preacher, a northern doctor, and a Kentucky judge would expose one of the South's darkest secrets, I want you to consider this. How many similar stories have been lost to history? How many times have ordinary people uncovered extraordinary crimes, only to be silenced by power and privilege? Tell us in the comments about a time when you've seen regular people stand up to authority, even when the odds were stacked against them. And if you're passionate about uncovering hidden history like we are, make sure you're subscribed to Hidden Histories with notifications turned on, because what Judge William Thornbury discovered about the Beaumont plantation would rock Kentucky society to its core, and create enemies who would stop at nothing to bury the truth. Judge William Thornbury was the last person anyone expected to challenge the established order of Warren County. Born into a prominent Kentucky family, educated at Transylvania University, he had built his career on careful legal reasoning and cautious political positions. He was, by all accounts, a moderate man in immoderate times. But William Thornbury had one quality that would prove decisive in the Beaumont case: an absolute commitment to the rule of law, regardless of who it made uncomfortable. Paper shuffling, official documents. When Dr. Hartwell approached Judge Thornbury in late August 1876, with Charity Mason's evidence, the judge's initial reaction was skeptical, but professional. According to court records that have only recently been made available through the Kentucky State Archives, Thornbury agreed to review the case, but warned that accusations against prominent citizens required extraordinary evidence. What he didn't expect was how quickly that evidence would accumulate. Dramatic music building. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: Colonel Beaumont's own business records. As part of any legal investigation, Judge Thornbury had the authority to subpoena plantation documents. What he discovered in those ledgers would expose not just a crime but a conspiracy that reached far beyond Warren County. Sound of turning pages, discovery music. The financial records told a story that contradicted everything in the public narrative. According to payroll ledgers, the 41 missing men had not completed their contracts and moved on. They had been assigned to a special project, paid at double wages, that began on July 15th, and was scheduled to continue through the end of harvest season. But here's the crucial detail: the project wasn't tobacco cultivation. Ominous pause, buried in Colonel Beaumont's private correspondence, which Judge Thornbury seized as part of the investigation, was a series of letters that revealed the true nature of the work that had consumed those 41 men. The project was excavation, large-scale digging in the remote southeastern section of the plantation. The question was, digging for what? Investigation music intensifies. The answer came from an unlikely source: geological surveys conducted by the Kentucky State Mining Commission. In 1875, a year before the disappearances, state geologists had identified significant coal deposits beneath the Beaumont plantation. The seams were deep but accessible, and potentially worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, a fortune by a coal mining required specialized knowledge, significant capital investment, and most importantly, absolute secrecy from competing interests, who might attempt to purchase or lease the mineral rights. Realization music. Suddenly the pieces began falling into place. Colonel Beaumont hadn't just been running a tobacco plantation. He had been conducting illegal mining operations using workers sworn to secrecy and paid premium wages to ensure their silence. But something had gone wrong. Terribly, fatally wrong. Dramatic pause. The evidence Judge Thornbury uncovered painted a picture of escalating deception and desperation. According to mining records hidden in Beaumont's personal safe, the coal excavation had encountered serious problems by mid-July 1876. Cave-ins, water infiltration, and most dangerous of all, the discovery that the mineral rights to the southeastern section actually belonged not to Beaumont but to a New York investment company. Beaumont had been mining coal he didn't own, using methods that violated both state mining regulations and federal workplace safety standards. If discovered, he faced not just financial ruin, but potential federal prosecution. Building tension. The 41 workers knew too much. They had seen the illegal operation. They had witnessed safety violations that had already caused injuries and near fatalities. Most damaging of all, they had heard conversations between Beaumont and his foreman about the disputed mineral right. In Colonel James Beaumont's private journal, seized by court order and kept sealed for nearly 150 years, the final entries from July 1876 reveal a man consumed by paranoia and desperation. July 14th, the New York representatives arrive next week to inspect their property. If they discover our operation, everything is lost. The workers cannot be allowed to speak of what they have seen. July 15th, desperate times require desperate measures. Some secrets are too dangerous to trust to any man's silence. Horrifying realization music. What happened next would transform a case of illegal mining into evidence of mass murder. Transition to darker, more ominous tone. But Judge Thornbury's investigation was about to encounter forces far more powerful than one desperate plantation owner. Because Colonel Beaumont hadn't acted alone, the conspiracy to silence the 41 workers involved some of the most prominent names in Kentucky society, men who had as much to lose as Beaumont if the truth came out, and they would stop at nothing to protect their secret. Cliffhanger building. Before we reveal the shocking extent of the conspiracy Judge Thornbury uncovered, I want to pause and ask you something. We've been investigating hidden histories for years now, and one thing consistently amazes us: how ordinary people throughout history have risked everything to stand up for what's right. Charity Mason could have stayed silent. Dr. Hartwell could have returned north. Judge Thornbury could have dismissed their concerns and avoided the controversy. Instead, they chose to seek the truth, no matter the cost. Tell us in the comments about someone in your life, past or present, who has shown that kind of moral courage. And if you believe these stories of courage and truth-seeking matter, please subscribe to Hidden Histories and share this video with someone who values justice. Because what we're about to reveal about the network of powerful men who conspired to cover up the Beaumont massacre will show you just how far people will go to protect wealth and power, and how much courage it takes to stand against. The conspiracy reached into the Kentucky state legislature, the banking industry, and even the railroad companies that were transforming the South. And at its center was a man whose name still graces buildings and streets across Kentucky today. Dark conspiratorial music. In 1876, Kentucky was experiencing rapid economic transformation. Railroads were connecting rural counties to national markets. Northern investment was flowing into southern industry, and a small group of interconnected businessmen and politicians were positioning themselves to control that transformation. At the center of this network sat Senator Marcus Caldwell, one of Kentucky's most powerful political figures, and a man whose influence extended far beyond state borders. Political power music building. Senator Caldwell's involvement in the Beaumont conspiracy wasn't immediately obvious. On the surface, he appeared to be simply another investor in Kentucky's economic development. But Judge Thornbury's investigation revealed connections that ran much deeper than mere business relationships. Document shuffling. Investigation sounds. The breakthrough came when Dr. Hartwell, continuing his own parallel investigation, discovered something that would shock even Judge Thornberry. Senator Caldwell was the secret owner of the New York investment company that held the mineral rights to Beaumont's land. Dramatic revelation music. Think about the implication. Caldwell owned the coal rights. Beaumont was stealing the coal, and both men had powerful reasons to ensure that no witnesses could testify about the illegal mining operation. But the conspiracy extended far beyond two men protecting their financial interests. Building tension. Judge Thornberry's court records, recently unsealed through a legal challenge brought by the Kentucky Historical Society, reveal a network of complicity that included who had been receiving payments from Beaumont for years in exchange for ignoring labor violations and safety complaints. And Nathaniel Ford, editor of the Bowling Green Daily News, whose family had significant investments in Caldwell's various business ventures. Dr. Samuel Morrison, the county coroner, who had been appointed to his position through Caldwell's political influence, and most shocking of all, Reverend Thomas Whitmore of the First Presbyterian Church, whose congregation included most of Warren County's elite families. Each name building the sense of overwhelming corruption. This wasn't just about covering up a crime. This was about protecting an entire system of power and privilege that depended on maintaining control over information, law enforcement, and public opinion. Investigative music intensifies. The evidence Judge Thornberry uncovered painted a picture of systematic planning and coordination. According to financial records, seized from multiple sources, Sheriff Hayes had been paid $500 in July 1876, more than a year's salary for most workers, to ensure that no official investigation would be launched into the missing workers. Editor Ford had received advertising payments from Caldwell's companies totaling over $1,000 during the summer of 1876, ensuring that newspaper coverage would support the official story of workers moving on to other opportunities. Dr. Morrison had been instructed to refuse to issue death certificates for any of the missing men, preventing families from pursuing legal remedies or insurance claims. Reverend Whitmore had used his pulpit to discourage speculation about the disappearances, framing continued searching as a lack of faith in God's plan. Horrifying realization building. But the most chilling evidence came from Senator Caldwell's private correspondence with Colonel Beaumont, letters that Judge Thornberry found hidden in a false bottom of Beaumont's desk. Paper rustling, dark revelation music. In a letter dated July 13, 1876, 2 days before the workers disappeared, Senator Caldwell wrote, "James, the situation has become untenable. The New York inspection cannot proceed as scheduled. Whatever measures are necessary to protect our interests must be taken immediately. I have spoken with our associates. They understand the gravity of the situation and are prepared to provide whatever support is required." The reply from Colonel Beaumont, dated July 16, the day after the disappearance, was even more damning. "Marcus, the problem has been resolved permanently. The Bottoms project is concluded. I trust our associates will ensure that no further complications arise." Pause for impact. Judge Thornberry now understood that he wasn't investigating a crime committed by one desperate plantation owner. He was facing a conspiracy that involved some of the most powerful men in Kentucky, men who had the resources and connections to destroy anyone who threatened them. Building to climax, but William Thornberry had spent his entire career believing in the power of law to triumph over corruption. He had evidence. He had witnesses, and he had the authority of his judicial office. What he didn't yet understand was how far the conspiracy would go to protect itself. Ominous transition. The first warning came in early September 1876, when Judge Thornberry's clerk found his courthouse office ransacked. Legal documents were scattered, but nothing appeared to be missing. The message was clear: "We can reach you anywhere." The second warning was more direct. A note slipped under the judge's door at home read simply, "Some secrets are better left buried. Ask Dr. Matthews." Tension building. Dr. Richard Matthews had been Judge Thornberry's predecessor on the bench, a respected jurist who had mysteriously resigned his position in 1874 and moved to California, citing health concerns. When Thornberry telegraphed Matthews in San Francisco, the reply was cryptic but terrifying. "William, some fights cannot be won, only survive. Protect yourself and those you love. The truth is not always worth the price of telling it." Dark realization. Judge Thornberry was beginning to understand that other people had tried to challenge this network of corruption before, and they had been silenced, through threats, bribery, or worse. But he also realized that he wasn't fighting alone. Music shifting to more hopeful but still tense. Charity Mason and Dr. Hartwell had continued their own investigation, and they had made a discovery that would provide the final piece of evidence needed to expose the conspiracy. Hidden in the basement of Mount Olive Baptist Church, wrapped in oiled cloth and buried beneath loose stones, they had found something that would prove, once and for all, what had happened to the 41 missing workers. Building to major revelation. Before we reveal what Charity Mason and Dr. Hartwell discovered, evidence so shocking that it would force even Senator Caldwell's powerful network to face justice, I want you to think about what we've learned so far. This isn't just a story about a historical crime. It's about how systems of power protect themselves, how ordinary people find the courage to challenge corruption, and how the truth, no matter how deeply buried, has a way of surfacing. Tell us in the comments, have you ever discovered something that powerful people wanted to keep hidden? How did you decide whether to speak up or stay silent? And if you're inspired by the courage of people like Charity Mason, Hartwell, and Judge Thornberry, please subscribe to Hidden Histories and hit that notification bell, because what we're about to reveal will show you that even the most powerful conspiracies can be brought down by ordinary people who refuse to let injustice stand. The evidence hidden in that church basement would not only prove what happened to the 41 workers, it would expose the entire network of corruption and lead to one of the most dramatic trials in Kentucky history. Dramatic discovery music. What Charity Mason and Dr. Hartwell found in the basement of Mount Olive Baptist Church would change everything. Hidden beneath loose stones, wrapped carefully in oiled cloth, was a leather satchel containing documents that someone had risked their life to preserve. Sound of unwrapping, paper rustling. The satchel belonged to Moses Franklin, the 19-year-old tobacco curer who had been among the 41 missing workers. But Moses had done something that none of the conspirators anticipated. He had kept detailed records of everything he witnessed during the illegal mining operation. Young man's voice, earnest and careful. Moses Franklin's journal, written in careful script that spoke to his basic education, provided an insider's view of the final weeks leading up to the massacre. His entries from early July 1876 revealed a young man excited about earning premium wages, but increasingly disturbed by what he was witnessing. July 3rd. Colonel Beaumont says the special work in the bottoms will pay double wages. Me and the other boys are excited about the money. My mama says I can help buy land if I save enough. July 8th. The digging is harder than expected. We're going deep, following seams of coal. Foreman says we can't tell nobody about the work, not even our families. Something don't feel right about all the secrecy. July 12th. Accident today. Cave-in nearly killed 3 men. Samuel Washington got hurt bad, but Foreman says no doctor. Colonel Beaumont came out to look at the damage, heard him arguing with another man about New York people and running out of time, getting scared. Tension building, but it was Moses Franklin's final entry, dated July 15, 1876, the morning of the disappearance, that provided the most crucial evidence. Something terrible is going to happen. Overheard Colonel Beaumont and the other man planning something for today. They kept saying, no witnesses, and permanent solution. I'm hiding this journal where Mama can find it if something happens to me. If you're reading this, tell everyone what we were doing in the bottoms. Tell them we were good men who just wanted to work. Heartbreaking pause. Moses Franklin knew he was going to die, and he had made sure the truth would survive him. Investigation music returning. Dr. Hartwell's examination of the journal confirmed its authenticity. The paper, ink, and handwriting were all consistent with a working-class young man's education in 1876. More importantly, technical details about the mining operation matched exactly with the geological surveys and financial records Judge Thornberry had uncovered. But the journal contained one more piece of evidence that would prove decisive: a hand-drawn map showing the exact locations where coal had been extracted and where the excavation equipment was hidden. Map unfolding sounds. On September 15, 1876, Judge Thornberry, Hartwell, and Charity Mason, accompanied by federal marshals from Louisville, conducted a comprehensive search of the southeastern section of Beaumont Plantation. What they found validated every suspicion, confirmed every fear, and provided evidence of a crime so systematic and brutal that it shocked even experienced law enforcement officials. Excavation sounds, somber discovery music. The search uncovered recent coal extraction, mining equipment buried in shallow graves throughout the area, personal effects belonging to the missing workers scattered across multiple locations, and most horrifying of all, evidence of what Federal Marshal Thomas Crawford described in his official report as systematic disposal of human remains. Heavy sorrowful music. The physical evidence confirmed what the documentary evidence had suggested. The 41 workers had been murdered to prevent them from testifying about the illegal mining operation. Their bodies had been disposed of in the abandoned mine shafts, which were then collapsed and covered with earth. But even with overwhelming evidence, bringing the conspirators to justice would require overcoming their powerful connections and the corruption they had spread throughout the local system. Building toward justice, Judge Thornberry faced a crucial decision. The evidence clearly justified arrests and prosecutions, but attempting to prosecute men as powerful as Senator Caldwell and Colonel Beaumont through the corrupted local system would likely result in acquittals and the permanent burial of the case. Instead, he made a choice that would transform a local crime into a federal case with national implications. Dramatic music building. On September 20, 1876, Judge Thornberry formally requested federal intervention, citing violations of constitutional rights, interstate commerce regulations, and federal mining laws. His petition to the U.S. Attorney's Office in Louisville detailed the evidence of conspiracy and requested that the case be prosecuted in federal court. The response was swift and decisive. Official government music. On September 25, 1876, federal marshals arrested Colonel James Beaumont, Senator Marcus Caldwell, Sheriff Robert Hayes, and 6 other conspirators on charges of conspiracy, murder, and violation of federal law. The arrests sent shockwaves through Kentucky society. 2 of the most powerful men in the state, along with prominent local officials, were facing federal prosecution for mass murder. Newspaper printing sounds. The story exploded across national newspapers. The Louisville Courier-Journal called it the most shocking crime in Kentucky's history. The Cincinnati Enquirer described it as evidence of the corruption that still plagues Reconstruction. Even the New York Times covered the arrests, noting the case's implications for Southern justice and federal oversight. But the conspirators weren't finished fighting. They had resources, connections, and lawyers who specialized in defending powerful men accused of terrible crimes. The trial that followed would become one of the most watched legal proceedings of the 1870s, a battle between justice and privilege that would determine whether ordinary people could challenge the most powerful interests in society. Courtroom anticipation music. Before we dive into the dramatic courtroom confrontation that would determine the fate of the Beaumont conspirators, I want to recognize something important. This case was solved because 3 people, a black preacher, a northern doctor, and a Kentucky judge, refused to accept injustice, even when fighting it seemed impossible. Tell us in the comments about a time when you've seen ordinary people make a difference against overwhelming odds. And if you believe that these stories of courage and determination matter for understanding our history and our present, please subscribe to Hidden Histories and share this video, because the trial we're about to explore will show you both the best and worst of American justice and demonstrate why the fight for truth never ends. The courtroom battle that followed would feature some of the most prominent lawyers in America, shocking revelations about corruption at the highest levels, and testimony that would finally give voice to the 41 men who had been silenced forever. Courtroom atmosphere, gavels, crowd murmurs. The trial of the Beaumont conspirators began on November 15, 1876, in the federal courthouse in Louisville. It was, by all accounts, the legal event of the decade in Kentucky. The courtroom was packed with reporters from across the nation, family members of the victims, and curious observers who came to witness whether federal justice could triumph over local corruption. Formal legal proceedings music. Presiding over the case was Judge Samuel Miller, a federal judge with an impeccable reputation and no connections to Kentucky politics. The prosecution was led by U.S. Attorney James Mitchell, who had built his career prosecuting corruption cases during Reconstruction. The defense team was equally impressive. Senator Caldwell had hired Robert Harlan, one of the most successful criminal defense attorneys in the South. Colonel Beaumont was represented by William Bradley, whose family connections to Kentucky's political elite were legendary. Tension building. But the trial's most dramatic moments would come not from the lawyers' arguments, but from the testimony of witnesses who had never expected to have their voices heard in any courtroom. Witness testimony music. Respectful, powerful. Charity Mason was the prosecution's first witness. Walking to the witness stand in her simple black dress, carrying her worn Bible, she represented everything the defense hoped to discredit. A black woman with no formal education, accusing prominent white men of murder, based on her own investigation. What followed was one of the most powerful pieces of testimony in 19th-century American legal history. Charity Mason's voice, strong, dignified, unwavering. Your Honor, I knew every one of those 41 men. I baptized some of them. I married some of them to their wives. I held their babies at christenings and prayed over their sick children. These weren't nameless workers who moved on to other opportunities. These were fathers and sons and brothers, and they are all dead because they knew something that powerful men wanted to keep secret. The defense's cross-examination was brutal, designed to discredit Mason's testimony by attacking her character, her race, and her lack of formal education. But Charity Mason had spent 42 years surviving in a world that told her she didn't matter. She wasn't intimidated by lawyers' defiant, dignified tone. When defense attorney Harlan suggested that her emotional attachment to the missing men had clouded her judgment, Mason's response silenced the courtroom. Sir, you're right that I'm emotional about 41 human beings being murdered. If that makes my testimony unreliable, then I'd suggest that anyone who isn't emotional about mass murder shouldn't be trusted with seeking justice. Courtroom reaction sounds. Dr. Hartwell's testimony provided the scientific credibility that corroborated Mason's investigation. His detailed medical analysis of the evidence found at the plantation, combined with his documentation of the search process, established the factual foundation for the prosecution's case. But it was Judge Thornberry's testimony that exposed the full scope of the conspiracy. Official, authoritative tone. Reading from seized documents and financial records, Judge Thornberry methodically detailed the network of corruption that had enabled the crime and the cover-up, payment records, correspondence between conspirators, evidence of systematic obstruction of justice. The defense strategy was predictable but effective. Attack the credibility of the investigation, question the authenticity of documents, and argue that any wrongdoing was limited to Colonel Beaumont acting alone, without the knowledge of his alleged co-conspirator. Defense arguments building. Senator Caldwell took the stand in his own defense, presenting himself as a legitimate businessman who had been betrayed by a rogue plantation owner. His testimony was polished, convincing, and completely plausible to anyone who hadn't seen the documentary evidence. Gentlemen of the jury, Caldwell testified, I am guilty of nothing more than trusting James Beaumont to manage his own affairs honorably. If he chose to engage in illegal mining operations without my knowledge, that is his crime, not mine. Tension building toward revelation. But the prosecution had saved their most devastating evidence for last. Dramatic music building. On the 7th day of the trial, Una Mitchell called a surprise witness, someone whose testimony would shatter the defense's careful construction of plausible deniability. Surprise witness music. Thomas Reed had been Colonel Beaumont's personal secretary and bookkeeper for over a decade. A quiet, meticulous man who had managed Beaumont's correspondence and financial affairs. Reed had access to information that even the most thorough investigation might have missed, and Thomas Reed had kept copies of everything. Reed's testimony revealed that the conspiracy was even more extensive than prosecutors suspected. Not only had Senator Caldwell been directly involved in planning the mining operation, he had been receiving regular reports on its progress and had personally approved the decision to eliminate potential witnesses. Devastating evidence building. The prosecution introduced dozens of documents that Reed had secretly copied, including letters between Caldwell and Beaumont discussing permanent solutions to the witness problem, financial records showing payments to Sheriff Hayes and other conspirators, correspondence with mining equipment suppliers, discussing the disposal of evidence, and most damning of all, a detailed timeline of the July 15th events that proved the murders had been planned and coordinated in advance. Courtroom drama intensifying. The defense's case collapsed under the weight of documentary evidence. Their cross-examination of Reed revealed that he had kept copies of incriminating documents because he had suspected from the beginning that he might someday need to protect himself from prosecution. Reed's final testimony provided the most chilling insight into the mindset of the conspirators. Mr. Caldwell told Colonel Beaumont that the workers were a loose thread that could unravel everything. He said that men who worked for wages would always be loyal to the highest bidder, and that dead men tell no tales. I wrote down those exact words because they frightened me. Judgment building. After 2 weeks of testimony, the case went to the jury on November. The deliberation lasted 18 hours, unusually long for a federal criminal case, suggesting that even with overwhelming evidence, some jurors struggled with the implications of convicting such prominent defendants. Verdict anticipation music. When the jury returned, the courtroom was packed beyond capacity. Reporters filled every available seat. Family members of the victims stood in the back, many holding photographs of their murdered loved ones. The verdict was unanimous. Guilty on all counts. Justice music, solemn but victorious. Colonel James Beaumont was sentenced to life imprisonment without possibility of parole. Senator Marcus Caldwell received the same sentence. Sheriff Robert Hayes and the other conspirators received terms ranging from 15 to 25 years in federal prison, but the trial's impact extended far beyond the individual convictions. Reflection music building. The Beaumont case established crucial legal precedents for federal prosecution of civil rights violations. It demonstrated that federal courts could overcome local corruption when constitutional rights were at stake, and it proved that ordinary people, even those without wealth, education, or political connections, could successfully challenge the most powerful interests in society. Building toward broader implications. The case also exposed the systematic nature of post-Reconstruction corruption and violence. Newspapers across the country editorialized about the need for continued federal oversight of Southern justice. Civil rights organizations pointed to the Beaumont prosecutions as evidence that federal law could protect ordinary citizens when local systems failed. Most importantly, the trial gave voice to the 41 men who had been murdered for the crime of witnessing corruption. Their names were read into the federal court record. Their families received some measure of justice. Their stories became part of American legal history, transitioned to aftermath. But even with convictions and sentences, the story of the Beaumont conspiracy wasn't over. Powerful people had been humiliated and imprisoned. Networks of corruption had been exposed. And in 1876 America, such victories for justice were never allowed to stand unchallenged. The forces that had enabled the original conspiracy were already working to ensure that the story of the 41 murdered workers would disappear from history. Ominous foreshadowing. Before we explore how the Beaumont case was systematically erased from public memory, and why it took nearly 150 years for the full truth to emerge, I want to pause and reflect on what we've learned. This case shows us that justice is possible, even against overwhelming odds, but it also shows us that powerful people will never stop trying to control the narrative, to bury uncomfortable truths, and to rewrite history in ways that protect their interests. Tell us in the comments, what stories from your community's history have been buried or forgotten? What truths do you think powerful people today might want to keep hidden? And if you believe that uncovering these hidden histories matters for understanding our present, please subscribe to Hidden Histories and share this video, because the final chapter of the Beaumont story, how it was systematically erased and why it's only now being rediscovered, will show you how history gets written, who gets to tell it, and why ordinary people must always fight to preserve the truth. Dark conspiratorial music returning. The convictions in the Beaumont case should have marked the end of the conspiracy. Justice had been served. The truth had been established in federal court. The story had been documented in newspapers across the nation. But in 1876 America, legal victory was only the beginning of a different kind of battle. The fight over how history would remember these events. Historical revision music, subtle, insidious. The systematic erasure of the Beaumont case from public memory began almost immediately after the trial ended. It was carried out not through dramatic conspiracies or violent suppression, but through the quiet, persistent manipulation of information that determines which stories survive and which disappear. Sound of printing presses, newspapers. The first phase was controlling contemporary coverage. While the trial itself had been extensively reported, follow-up coverage began to diminish rapidly. Stories about the sentences, the appeals process, and the broader implications of the case received less and less attention from editors who were increasingly influenced by business and political interest. Nathaniel Ford, the Bowling Green Daily News editor, who had been convicted as part of the conspiracy, had been replaced by his nephew William Ford. The new editor began a systematic campaign to minimize local coverage of anything related to the Beaumont case, arguing that continued focus on the tragedy was harmful to community healing and economic development. Historical manipulation building. More insidiously, the Ford family began using their newspaper to promote alternative narratives about the missing workers. Stories appeared suggesting that some of the supposedly murdered men had actually been seen in other states. Articles questioned the reliability of the evidence and the motivations of the prosecutors. By 1878, barely 2 years after the convictions, the Bowling Green Daily News was running editorials arguing that the federal prosecution had been politically motivated, designed to humiliate Kentucky leadership and justify continued federal interference in local affairs. Corruption of narrative music. The second phase involved controlling official records and documentation. While federal court records couldn't be destroyed, local records related to the case began disappearing from courthouse files, newspaper archives, and even church records. The Mount Olive Baptist Church, where Charity Mason had served as pastor, was destroyed by fire in 1879, under mysterious circumstances. While the congregation rebuilt, many of the church's historical records, including Mason's journals and correspondence related to the Beaumont investigation, were lost. Loss and destruction sounds. Similarly, Judge Thornberry's personal papers, which had been donated to the Warren County Historical Society after his death in 1889, were reported stolen during a break-in at the Society's offices in. The thieves apparently ignored valuable artifacts and focused exclusively on documents related to 1870s legal cases. Building towards systematic erasure, the third and most effective phase was the gradual transformation of the narrative in official histories and educational materials, academic scholarly music. When Kentucky historians began writing comprehensive accounts of the Reconstruction era in the 1890s and early 1900s, the Beaumont case was either omitted entirely or mentioned only briefly as an example of federal overreach and politically motivated prosecution. The 1904 Comprehensive History of Warren County by historian Daniel Matthews devoted less than 2 pages to what had been the most significant legal case in the county's history. Matthews described it as an unfortunate incident that was exploited by federal authorities seeking to embarrass local leadership. Revision of history continuing educational textbooks used in Kentucky schools throughout the early 20th century either ignored the case completely or presented heavily sanitized versions that focused on misunderstandings and business disputes rather than mass murder and conspiracy. By the 1920s, most Kentucky residents under the age of 50 had never heard of the Beaumont case. The story had been successfully erased from public consciousness. Success of the cover-up. But the most chilling aspect of the historical cover-up was how it extended beyond mere omission. Positive narratives about the convicted conspirators began appearing in local histories. Senator Marcus Caldwell, who had died in federal prison in 1884, was posthumously rehabilitated as a Kentucky statesman who fought against federal interference in local affairs. By the 1930s, a scholarship at the University of Kentucky was established in his name, honoring his contributions to Kentucky's economic development. Colonel James Beaumont, who had also died in prison, was remembered in local histories as a progressive plantation owner who provided employment opportunities for former slaves and worked to modernize agricultural practices. Moral outrage building. The families of the 41 murdered workers were written out of history entirely. Their names disappeared from local records. Their descendants, many of whom remained in Warren County, learned to stay silent about their family history. Charity Mason, whose courage and determination had made the investigation possible, was reduced to a footnote in church histories as a local pastor who assisted federal authorities during a difficult period. Historical injustice music. This systematic erasure wasn't unique to the Beaumont case. Across the post-Reconstruction South, similar processes were transforming historical narratives to minimize evidence of violence and corruption, while rehabilitating the reputations of those who had perpetrated crimes against ordinary people. Broader context building. The success of this historical revision campaign had consequences that extended far beyond one Kentucky county. By erasing evidence of systematic violence and corruption, the revised histories made it easier for similar patterns to continue in new form. When civil rights activists in the 1960s pointed to historical patterns of violence and conspiracy, they were often told that such claims were exaggerated or unsupported by evidence. But the evidence hadn't been lacking. It had been systematically suppressed and destroyed. Present-day implications. The Beaumont case remained buried until the late 20th century, when a new generation of historians began using previously unexplored archives and applying new research methodologies to uncover suppressed history. Discovery music. Hope emerging from darkness. The breakthrough came in 1994, when Dr. Sarah Williams, a graduate student at the University of Kentucky, was researching federal court records for her dissertation on Reconstruction-era legal cases. While examining boxes of documents that had been misfiled in the National Archives, she discovered the complete trial transcripts from the Beaumont case. Excitement of discovery. Dr. Williams' initial reaction was disbelief. How had such a significant case, involving prominent political figures, mass murder, and federal intervention, been completely omitted from Kentucky historical narrative? Her subsequent research uncovered the systematic nature of the historical cover-up, and began the process of restoring the Beaumont case to its rightful place in American history. Academic investigation music. Williams' 1996 book, Buried Truths, The Beaumont Conspiracy and the Erasure of Reconstruction Violence, became a landmark work in Southern historical study. It demonstrated not only what had happened in Warren County in 1876, but how such stories had been systematically suppressed throughout the South. The book's publication led to renewed interest in other lost cases from the Reconstruction era, contributing to a broader re-evaluation of post-Civil War Southern history. Building toward contemporary relevance, but Dr. Williams' research also revealed something that brings the Beaumont story into sharp contemporary focus: the patterns of corruption, cover-up, and historical erasure that characterize the 1876 case continue to shape how power operates in America today. Contemporary relevance building. The same techniques used to bury the Beaumont story, controlling media narratives, manipulating official records, and gradually rewriting history to protect powerful interests, remain common tools for suppressing uncomfortable truths about wealth and injustice. Present-day connections music. Understanding how the Beaumont case was erased helps us recognize similar processes at work in our own time. When stories of corruption or violence involving powerful people receive limited coverage, when official records become mysteriously unavailable, when historical narratives shift to protect certain interests, we can recognize the pattern.
The rediscovery of the Beaumont case also raises crucial questions about what other stories have been buried, what other truths have been systematically suppressed, and what other injustices continue to be hidden by the same networks of power that concealed mass murder and a transition to conclusion. Before we explore the contemporary implications of the Beaumont story and what it teaches us about the ongoing struggle between truth and power, I want you to think about the stories we've shared today. Charity Mason, Hartwell, and Judge Thornbury proved that ordinary people can challenge the most powerful interests and win, but the systematic erasure of their victory shows us that winning once isn't enough. Every generation must fight again to preserve truth and justice. Tell us in the comments, what stories from your community have been forgotten or suppressed? What parallels do you see between the Beaumont conspiracy and contemporary events? And if you believe that uncovering and preserving these hidden histories is crucial for our democracy, please subscribe to Hidden Histories, share this video, and help us continue this important work. Because the final lesson of the Beaumont legacy isn't just about what happened it's about what's happening right now, wherever ordinary people are standing up to power, wherever truth is being suppressed, and wherever justice needs defending. Reflective, powerful music building. As we reach the end of our investigation into the Beaumont legacy, I want you to imagine something. Picture yourself walking through the southeastern section of what was once Colonel Beaumont's plantation. The land is peaceful now, rolling hills covered with new-growth forest, crossed by hiking trails that attract visitors to Warren County State Park. Peaceful nature sounds, wind through trees. There's no historical marker commemorating the 41 men who died there, no monument listing their names. Most visitors have no idea they're walking over one of the largest crime scenes in Kentucky history. But if you know what to look for, if you understand the story we've uncovered today, you can still see the evidence. Slight depressions in the earth where mine shafts were collapsed and filled, unusual vegetation patterns where the soil chemistry was permanently altered, the remnants of a conspiracy that powerful people thought they had buried forever. Connecting past to present, the Beaumont legacy teaches us three crucial lessons that remain as relevant today as they were in 1876. Building to key insights. First, that ordinary people have extraordinary power when they refuse to accept injustice. Charity Mason was a black woman in the post-Reconstruction South, with no formal education, no political connections, and no legal authority. Dr. Hartwell was a northern transplant, with no ties to local power structure. Judge Thornbury was a moderate jurist who could have easily avoided controversy, but together they brought down one of the most powerful conspiracy networks in Kentucky history. They proved that courage, persistence, and moral clarity can triumph over wealth, influence, and corruption. Inspiration building. Their victory reminds us that every generation faces the same choice. Will we speak up when we witness injustice, even when it's dangerous? Will we investigate when something doesn't seem right, even when powerful people want us to stay silent? Will we fight for truth, even when it's easier to look the other way? Moral challenge. Second, the Beaumont legacy shows us how systematically truth can be suppressed, and history rewritten to protect powerful interests. The erasure of this story wasn't accidental or gradual. It was a coordinated campaign involving media manipulation, destruction of evidence,
and the gradual transformation of historical narratives. Contemporary warnings: this process didn't end in the 90s. It continues today, wherever powerful people work to control information, suppress uncomfortable truths, and shape public understanding of events to protect their interests. Media literacy message: when we see stories that receive limited coverage despite their significance, when official records become mysteriously unavailable, when narratives shift in ways that consistently benefit certain groups while marginalizing others, we should recognize the pattern and ask hard questions about what might be hidden. Call to vigilance. Third, and most importantly, the Beaumont legacy demonstrates that the fight for justice never ends. Legal victories can be overturned, historical truths can be buried, but they can also be rediscovered, restored, and used to inspire new generations of truth-seekers. Hope and determination. Dr. Sarah Williams' rediscovery of the Beaumont case in the 1990s proved that buried truths have a way of surfacing. Her work inspired other historians to search for suppressed stories throughout the South. Those investigations have uncovered dozens of similar cases, evidence of systematic violence and corruption that was deliberately erased from public memory. Broader historical recovery. Today we know about the Beaumont conspiracy because someone refused to let the story stay buried. We know the names of the 41 murdered workers because someone was willing to dig through mislabeled archives and challenge accepted historical narratives. Personal responsibility. Each of us has the same opportunity and responsibility. In our communities, our workplaces, our families, there are stories that need to be told, truths that need to be preserved, and injustices that need to be challenged. Community engagement building. The question is, will we have the courage of Charity Mason, the persistence of Dr. Hartwell, and the integrity of Judge Thornberry? Will we speak up when we witness wrongdoing? Will we investigate when something doesn't make sense? Will we fight to preserve truth, even when it's inconvenient or dangerous? Direct challenge to viewers. Tell us in the comments about hidden histories in your community that need to be uncovered. Share stories about ordinary people you know who have shown extraordinary courage in fighting injustice. And if you're inspired by the example of the people who exposed the Beaumont conspiracy, please subscribe to Hidden Histories, share our videos, and help us continue uncovering the buried truths that shape our understanding of America. Mission statement building. Because here's what we've learned from investigating dozens of hidden histories. The forces that enabled the Beaumont conspiracy, corruption, cover-ups, the systematic suppression of truth, didn't disappear, they evolved, adapted, and continue to operate in new forms. Contemporary relevance.